Her name was Elena Marin, though most who knew her in the service simply called her Marin. It was a name that carried both simplicity and strength, the kind that belonged easily on a roll call or stitched across a uniform. She had enlisted young, barely 20, her hair still catching the fire of late summer sunlight and her heart full of a restless conviction. Some people join the military to escape, some to prove something, and some to serve a cause larger than themselves. Elena's reasons were woven from all three, threads of longing, duty, and a quiet hunger to find where she belonged. The first days of training pressed into her memory like photographs that would never fade. Boots against gravel at dawn, the chill of dew still clinging to the earth, and the rasp of voices barking cadence into the waking sky. She remembered her hands trembling slightly the first time she shouldered the weight of her pack, not because it was too heavy, but because she knew it marked the beginning of a life she could not turn back from. The barracks smelled of detergent and iron, the air humming with nervous energy. At night, exhaustion pressed down like a thick blanket, yet beneath it, there was always a small spark of pride warming her chest. It wasn't easy. Nothing about it was supposed to be. The mornings came sharp and merciless, and the drills left her body aching, but there was something healing in the rhythm of it, something almost sacred in being reshaped by discipline. Elena learned how to endure, how to move as one with the squad beside her, how to let the sound of boots striking earth beat in time with her own pulse. She learned, too, that her silence could be as strong as her words, her determination as commanding as any shouted order. Among the soldiers she trained with, there were whispers of doubt about her, about whether she belonged. A woman standing in their ranks was not new, but it was still something that unsettled the old guard, those who carried their prejudices like unseen metals. Once, in the middle of a grueling drill, she caught the sound of muttered voices behind her. "She won't last. She doesn't have it." She didn't turn to answer, but she felt the words sting, felt them burn like sparks landing on bare skin. That night, lying awake on her narrow cot, she stared at the ceiling until dawn bled into the room. Then she rose with the others, laced her boots, and pushed herself harder than before. In time, respect came, not from her insistence but from her endurance. Sweat on her brow, grit beneath her nails, calluses forming on her palms where the rifle rested day after day. She grew steadier, stronger, and with each mile run, each obstacle crossed, she began to feel the faint outline of belonging take shape. The tattoo she carried close to her heart, the black ink of a winged arrow etched with the number D, 17, was not just ink on skin. It was a silent vow, a reminder of a promise she made to herself long before the uniform. It was the mark of her journey, the declaration that her story was her own to claim. Sometimes, when night fell and the world quieted, Elena would sit alone on the edge of the compound, her breath mingling with the cool air. She would think of her family back home, of the faces that had watched her leave with both pride and fear in their eyes. She would think, too, of the unknown paths that stretched ahead, deployment uncertainty, perhaps loss. And yet, even in those moments of quiet reckoning, she felt a steadiness growing within her. The military wasn't simply taking her strength, it was showing her the strength she had carried all along. One evening, after a particularly brutal march that left most of her unit limping into camp, a fellow soldier glanced at her and muttered, "You're tougher than you look." It was not said with malice, but with the tired honesty of someone who had seen her fight through pain without complaint. Elena allowed herself the smallest of smiles, the kind that rose like sunlight breaking through cloud. She said nothing in reply because she knew she didn't need to. Her beginnings were not the polished victories of a storybook. They were forged in aching muscles, whispered doubts, and the quiet fire of persistence. But in them lay the roots of something unshakable, a resilience that would carry her into storms far greater than she yet knew. For now, though, in those early days, she stood in her uniform with a tattoo pressed close to her chest, her gaze steady, her silence resolute. She had not come to prove herself to others. She had come to claim herself. And in that, she was already winning. The desert air had a way of searing itself into the skin. It carried grit into the mouth, dried the throat, and clung like dust to every seam of the uniform. Elena Marin had learned quickly that deployment was nothing like training. Training had structure, rhythm, even a certain safety in its repetition. But here, on the edge of a foreign land that seemed to stretch endlessly under a burning sky, there was no rhythm, only tension woven into every step. The mornings began with the sound of engines rumbling awake, their growl echoing across the compound. Helicopters lifted against the horizon, chopping the air with a violence that rattled the bones. Soldiers moved briskly, their boots crunching against sand that shifted like a restless tide. Elena kept her head down, her focus sharp. Orders came like clipped thunder, and every movement carried the weight of consequence. She remembered the first patrol that carved itself into her memory. The Humvee jolted along uneven ground, the windows coated in a film of dust that blurred the world outside into muted shades of beige and rust. The air inside was thick with sweat and metal, the stench of tension unspoken. Her rifle rested heavy in her lap, her hands steady though her pulse betrayed her. Outside, children sometimes waved from the roadside, their eyes bright and unreadable. She forced herself to wave back, though inside she wondered if the small gesture meant safety or painted her as a target. Every sound became amplified in the field, the snap of fabric in the wind, the hollow thud of boots on stone, the sudden crack of distant gunfire. The first time it came, she felt it in her chest before her ears registered it. The squad scattered, instincts drilled into them springing alive, the world collapsing into a tunnel of noise and motion. She pressed her cheek against the rifle stock, her finger brushing the trigger guard, her breath shallow but controlled. Time stretched thin. When the skirmish ended as quickly as it had erupted, silence fell heavy, more suffocating than the gunfire had been. That night, she lay in her cot listening to the quiet hum of the generator outside, the glow of a lantern casting shadows that flickered like restless ghosts. Her hands trembled when she unlaced her boots, though she tried to hide it. She thought of the voice she once heard during training, the one that said she wouldn't last. Now, she wondered if perhaps it had not been doubt but a warning. Still, she rose the next morning, as she always did. The hardest struggle was not the heat, nor the endless patrols, nor even the sharp sting of fear when danger hovered too close. It was the silence that followed, the heavy, suffocating silence that settled in after loss. One late afternoon, her unit returned without one of their own. A young soldier, barely older than she had been when she enlisted, was gone in the sudden cruelty of an explosion that had left nothing to carry back but his name. His bunk stood empty, his belongings folded neatly, as though he might return for them. The air in the barracks seemed heavier that night, conversations muted, laughter absent. Elena sat alone at the edge of her cot, staring at the tattoo inked on her chest beneath her shirt. The winged arrow seemed to burn against her skin, a mark that tethered her to something beyond herself. She pressed her palm against it, as if holding on to a promise she could not yet articulate. She felt grief settle into her, not loud or violent, but quiet and enduring, like a shadow that would never fully leave. She found herself carrying that silence into every patrol afterward. The sound of boots on sand reminded her of footsteps now gone. The sight of a helmet resting on an empty bunk reminded her of the fragility of all their lives. Yet within the sorrow, something else grew, a fierce determination, sharp and steady. She would endure, not only for herself but for those who could no longer march beside her. On the hardest nights, when fear pressed too close and memories clawed at her chest, she would slip outside, letting the cool desert wind sting her face. She would look up at the sky, vast and scattered with stars, and let herself breathe. She would think of her family back home, of her comrades asleep around her, of the young soldier whose name now lived only in memory. She would whisper his name softly into the night, as though the wind might carry it somewhere safe. The struggle etched itself into her not as weakness, but as a kind of scar that told its own story. It was there in the way she steadied her hands before every mission, in the way her voice carried calm when others faltered, in the way she stood straighter even when her shoulders ached. It was the kind of strength born not from conquest but from survival, from choosing to keep walking when every step felt heavier than the last. By the end of that deployment, Elena had learned that war did not shout, it whispered. It whispered in empty bunks, in folded flags, in the silence that stretched between gunfire. And though it had carved its weight into her, it had also revealed something she had not known she possessed, a resilience that did not break, even when bent by grief. And so, beneath the burning sky and endless expanse of desert, she carried on. Her struggle had not ended, it had only begun to shape her. The plane home touched down beneath a gray sky, its wheels shuddering against the runway, the vibration running through Elena Marin's bones like a reminder that she was no longer where she had been. The war had ended for her, at least in its physical sense, but it clung invisibly still, woven into her body, her breath, her quiet gaze. Stepping off the aircraft, the air smelled different, softer, carrying the dampness of rain on concrete instead of dust on sand. Around her, families surged forward, arms outstretched, voices breaking with joy. Elena stood slightly apart, her bag slung over one shoulder, her posture steady, but her eyes distant. The embrace she received from her mother was warm, trembling, almost desperate. Her father's hand on her back was firm but lingered too long, as though afraid she might vanish if he let go. Elena smiled for them, tried to let their love bridge the silence inside her, but she felt the weight of something unsaid pressing between her ribs. Homecoming was supposed to feel like peace, yet it arrived wrapped in dissonance. The streets were familiar, the faces unchanged, but she had been reshaped by a place they could not see. Nights were the hardest. In her childhood room, surrounded by posters fading at the edges and shelves of books untouched for years, Elena lay awake listening. The silence was different here, gentler, but it startled her still. Her body expected the distant hum of engines, the sudden crack of gunfire, the clipped rhythm of shouted orders. Instead, there was only the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the muted bark of a neighbor's dog, the ticking of the clock on her wall. Each sound should have comforted her, but instead, they pulled her deeper into restlessness. Sleep came fractured, and when it did, it carried her back to the desert, to faces that would not return. She hid it well in daylight. She rose early, ran along the neighborhood sidewalks, the thud of her shoes striking pavement in steady rhythm. She met friends for coffee, laughed when laughter was expected, told stories carefully edited to fit the space between their questions and her silence. But inside, the ache remained. The loss she carried was not visible, not like a scar that could be traced with a finger, but it was there all the same. The turning point arrived quietly, almost without her realizing it. One afternoon, she walked past a veteran center tucked between a library and a row of shops. The sign was small, almost unremarkable, but something about it drew her in. Inside, the air was warm, the faint smell of brewed coffee mingling with the softer scent of paper and wood. A man greeted her at the desk, his hair gray at the temples, his voice calm, steady. He didn't ask her what branch she had served in or where she had been. He simply said, "Welcome home." Those words unraveled something in her. She sat in one of the chairs, her hands clasped together, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to speak. Slowly at first, about the heat, the marches, the sound of engines, but then more openly about the silence that followed, about the empty bunk that haunted her, about the weight that never lifted. The man listened, not with pity, but with the quiet recognition of someone who had carried his own ghosts. In the weeks that followed, Elena returned often. She met others, women and men whose stories echoed her own in unexpected ways. They shared memories that were heavy, sometimes unbearable, but also laughter that came sharp and sudden, like light cracking through storm clouds. It was in those shared spaces that she began to feel the edges of healing. The tattoo on her chest, once a secret she rarely revealed, became a point of conversation one evening. Another veteran, a woman with a scar tracing down her arm, asked about it. Elena hesitated, then pulled the collar of her shirt aside just enough for the ink to show. "It's a promise," she said softly. "To carry forward. To keep going." The woman nodded, her eyes bright, as though she understood without needing more. Elena found herself spending time outdoors again, walking in the park, feeling the cool brush of wind against her face, watching the way leaves shifted with the season. She noticed details she had once overlooked: the smell of fresh earth after rain, the laughter of children playing tag, the distant chime of a bicycle bell. These small moments did not erase what she carried, but they reminded her that the world still offered beauty alongside the weight of memory. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft hues of orange and violet, Elena stood by the river near her hometown. The water moved steady, reflecting the fading light in ripples. She touched the tattoo over her heart and breathed deeply. For the first time, the ache inside her did not feel like it was pulling her under. It felt like a current carrying her forward. Her turning point was not a single dramatic moment, but a collection of small ones. A greeting, a conversation, a shared silence, a glimpse of the world's quiet beauty. Each reminded her that healing was not about forgetting, but about carrying memory with dignity. She would never erase the shadows of the desert, nor the voices of those who were gone. But she could learn to walk alongside them, to let their memories strengthen rather than shatter her. And as the evening light faded into night, Elena felt something she had not felt in a long while. Not peace exactly, but the beginning of it. The years passed not in sudden leaps, but in the slow, steady rhythm of ordinary life. Elena Marin had found work at a community center, helping younger veterans navigate the uncertain terrain of returning home. It was not a path she had once imagined for herself, but it became a calling she could not ignore. Each morning she unlocked the center's doors, the scent of brewed coffee and fresh paper rising in the quiet halls, and prepared to welcome those who arrived carrying invisible weights of their own. The stories she heard were heavy, each one different, yet threaded with the same ache. A young man haunted by the silence after combat. A mother of two who could not fall asleep without reliving the sounds of helicopters overhead. A woman who carried the guilt of survival, her smile fragile but determined. Elena listened with the same patience she had once been shown, her eyes steady, her voice soft but unwavering. She never offered empty promises of healing, only presence, her being there, bearing witness, without judgment. Sometimes that was enough. Her own nights were easier now, though not without shadows. There were still moments when sleep fractured, when memory pressed itself too vividly into her dreams. But she had learned how to meet those moments with breath, how to anchor herself in the present. The rustle of tree leaves outside her window, the steady rise and fall of her chest, the warmth of a quilt pulled close. Healing had not erased her scars, it had taught her how to live with them. The tattoo remained close to her heart, the ink dark and certain, as much a part of her as her own pulse. Over time it had shifted meaning. Where once it had been a private vow of survival, now it felt like a bridge, connecting her to those she had lost, and to those who still carried on. When she traced its lines with her fingertips, she thought of the desert, the weight of loss, and the resilience that followed. It was not about revealing the tattoo to others, but about knowing its truth herself. She was still here, still standing, still carrying forward. One autumn afternoon, she joined a small gathering at the Veterans Memorial in her town. The air was cool, the sky washed with the pale blue of the season, and the trees rustled with leaves that had begun to burn gold and crimson. Families clustered quietly, some holding photographs, some holding folded flags, their faces a mixture of pride and grief. Elena stood among them, her hands folded in front of her, the wind brushing strands of hair across her face. When the names were read aloud, she felt the familiar ache rise, steady and sharp. She closed her eyes for a moment, hearing not only the names, but the voices that had once carried them. The laughter in the barracks, the quiet hum of conversation before a patrol, the silence of absence. She breathed deeply, letting the weight of memory wash through her without drowning her. After the ceremony, a young soldier approached her. He was barely older than she had been when she first enlisted, his uniform crisp, his eyes carrying the same restless conviction she once knew. "You served?" he asked, as though sensing it before seeing it. "I did," she answered gently. He hesitated, then asked, "Was it worth it?" Elena studied his face, the earnest question lingering there. She thought of the desert sun, the silence of loss, the long nights of restless memory. She thought, too, of the laughter that had survived even in the harshest places, of the friendships that felt like family, of the strength she had discovered when she believed she had none left. "It changes you," she said finally. "It takes something, yes. But it also gives you something you'll carry forever. You'll learn who you are in ways you never expected. And in the end, that matters." The soldier nodded, as though tucking her words away for later. He thanked her quietly, and she watched him walk back toward his unit, the crisp sound of his boots against the stone path echoing faintly in the autumn air. That evening, Elena returned home and sat by her window, watching the sun descend behind the trees. The sky shifted into shades of rose and violet, the light fading into soft shadow. She rested her hand over her tattoo, feeling its outline through the fabric of her shirt. A quiet strength lingered there, not loud, not triumphant, but steady and enduring. She thought of the ones she had lost, of the faces that would never fade, of the silence that had once felt unbearable. Now that silence felt different. It was not absence, but presence. They lived on in her memory, in her breath, in every step she took forward. As darkness settled, she whispered a promise into the quiet room, not only for herself, but for all who had walked the same path. She promised to keep carrying forward, to keep honoring the lives interwoven with her own, to keep building a world where strength was measured not by what was hidden, but by what was shared. Elena Marin was no longer the young woman who had once trembled beneath the weight of her first pack. She was no longer the soldier, haunted solely by loss. She was a veteran, yes, but more than that, she was a survivor, a guide, a reminder that healing was not the absence of pain, but the endurance of hope. And as she sat there, the night quiet around her, Elena understood something she had not before. The story of her life was not just marked by war, but by the resilience that followed it. And in that, she was not alone. The winter sun slanted low across the town, casting long shadows over sidewalks dusted with frost. Elena Marin wrapped her coat tighter, her boots crunching lightly on the frozen ground as she made her way toward the community hall. She had agreed, reluctantly at first, to speak at a local school's veterans program. The invitation had sat on her desk for days, the paper crisp and expectant, until she finally said yes. She wasn't sure what compelled her. Perhaps the thought that silence, while once necessary, no longer defined her. The hall smelled faintly of chalk and floor polish. Rows of students filled the folding chairs, their chatter rising and falling in a restless rhythm until the principal called them to attention. Elena stood at the side, her hands clasped in front of her, the familiar flutter of nerves tapping at her ribs. She had faced deployment, loss, and the silence that followed, but speaking openly about it felt like another kind of courage entirely. When her name was called, she stepped to the podium. The microphone hummed softly as she adjusted it, the metal cool against her fingertips. For a moment, she simply looked out, at the rows of young faces, some curious, some distracted, some intent. And then she began. She did not speak in dramatic bursts or with rehearsed grandeur. Instead, her words came measured, gentle, like stones placed carefully on a path. She told them about enlisting, about long marches and heavy packs, about the grit that clung to skin and memory alike. She told them, too, about loss, though not in detail, only enough for them to feel the weight of it. And then, she spoke of resilience, of finding strength not in being unbroken, but in learning to live with what could not be undone. The room had grown still. Even the restless tapping of pencils had faded. A girl in the second row leaned forward slightly, her expression caught between wonder and concern. Elena noticed her, and in that gaze, she saw the same hunger, she had once carried, the longing to know if she was enough to meet the world. When the talk ended, the students applauded politely, but it was the quiet questions afterward that mattered most. A boy approached her shyly, asking if fear ever went away. Another asked if she regretted joining. Elena answered as honestly as she could. Fear never disappeared, she said, but you learned how to move with it. And no, she did not regret it, because service had taught her not just who she was, but who she could be. Later, as she walked home beneath a pale evening sky, she felt the cold sting her cheeks, the kind of cold that wakes rather than numbs. She thought about the girl leaning forward, the boy asking about fear, and she realized something. The story she carried was not hers alone. It belonged also to those who listened, who needed to know that strength could be quiet, that healing could be slow, that survival itself was a form of courage. At home, she lit a small candle on her kitchen table, its flame flickering softly in the dim room. She sat with a cup of tea warming her hands and let her mind wander. She thought of her comrades, of the names etched into memory, of the tattoo pressed close against her chest. She touched it lightly through the fabric of her shirt, feeling its familiar lines, the silent vow it held. It no longer felt like a wound or even a secret. It felt like a light, steady and enduring. Outside her window, the world moved gently. The branches swayed in the wind, bare now but waiting for spring. Somewhere in the distance, laughter echoed faintly, the sound carrying across the quiet streets. Elena closed her eyes and listened, letting the sound rest in her chest. In recent years, she had learned that hope was not a sudden blaze, but a steady ember, something that glowed even when the world felt dark. She had carried it through the desert, through silence and grief, and now she carried it into every conversation, every hand she held at the Veteran Center, every story she shared with those who needed to hear it. Her reflection in the window caught her eye, a woman older than the one who had first enlisted, her face marked not by hardship alone but by endurance. Her eyes held the same steady fire, though tempered now with gentleness. She studied that reflection for a long moment, then allowed herself a smile, soft, quiet, but real. As the candlelight flickered and the evening deepened, Elena Marin understood that her journey had never been only about survival. It had been about carrying forward, carrying the weight of memory, the strength of resilience, the promise of hope. She was not defined by what she had endured, but by how she chose to live beyond it. And so, as night settled softly around her, Elena whispered a final vow, not of war, but of life, to keep walking, to keep carrying, to keep offering light in the quiet ways she could. For in that, she had found not only her healing, but her purpose.